I'll never forget the day I opened the letter and learned my family's 2 acres the land my grandfather poured his life into had been sold. Not by us. No. Some corporation, with help from the HOA, had done it. They'd found some legal loophole, and just like that it was gone. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Who does something like that? But they didn't realize who they were dealing with. I wasn't about to let it slide. This is the story of how I took matters into my own hands. Tell me in the comments, what would you do if you discovered your land had just vanished like that? That 1,200 acres handed down from my grandfather and built on decades of sweat and grit was sold off for only $50,000. It felt like someone had stolen part of me. The letter came on a Tuesday morning in March. Something about the official letterhead immediately made my stomach tighten. I wasn't expecting anything from the tax office. I'd paid everything on time for years, and the land was in good shape. The envelope felt heavier than usual, which should have been my first warning. I poured my coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and braced for whatever bureaucratic nonsense they'd cooked up this time. What I read was so absurd I actually laughed, though, looking back. I probably should have taken it more seriously from the start. The paper felt thick in my hands as I scanned the cold, bold text. My heart dropped when I saw the words, "The lien on your property has been transferred to Pinehurst Development Corporation." I read it 3 times, unable to believe it. My grandfather had spent his life transforming raw, wild land into something beautiful, something to leave for me. He used to say, "This land is freedom. Don't let anyone take it from you." Now some corporation I'd never even heard of supposedly owned it. I looked out my kitchen window toward the fields my grandfather had cleared by hand, trying to make a sense of what could have triggered this seizure of property that had been in our family for generations. It was a perfect morning, the kind that reminded me why I lived here. I walked the land, thinking about how it might look to these corporate opportunists. It was well kept, recently surveyed, boundaries clear, taxes current. Nothing about it screamed delinquent. Yet somehow, a $50,000 lien had supposedly justified taking land worth over $2 million. There were no unpaid assessments, no violations, no legal reason I could see for a seizure. But in the documents they claimed they'd followed proper legal procedures for tax lien recovery and property acquisition. My 1,200 acres supporting 3 generations of my family apparently vanished through some process I'd never been warned about or allowed to contest. I tore through every piece of mail from the past year, looking for any sign of a warning. That's when a name jumped out at me: Katherine Sterling, listed as the HOA representative who facilitated the transfer on behalf of community development interests. Katherine had been HOA president for 3 years, ever since moving from up north. She was the type of woman who looked ready for a board meeting even when walking her tiny designer dog. When I called the HOA office, I tried to keep my voice calm. "Miss Sterling, I need to understand exactly what happened with my property," she answered with that practiced, polite tone that carried no real empathy. As you can see from the documentation, the property was subject to outstanding tax obligations that required immediate resolution through established legal procedures. I double-checked my records, "Miss Sterling. I have receipts for every tax payment. I never received any notice about overdue taxes or pending legal action." Her answer was smooth but evasive. "Mr. Walker, property ownership can involve complex legal obligations beyond simple tax payments. Your land was subject to special assessments that required prompt resolution." That phrase, special assessments, hit me. Charges I'd never been told about, let alone given a chance to dispute. "Then show me the documentation for these assessments," I said, "because right now, this looks fraudulent." She pushed back, saying responsible owners comply with municipal requirements. I countered that reasonable people follow proper legal procedures and notify owners. She mentioned legal authority and enforcement mechanisms, but my focus had already shifted. The legal paperwork wasn't standard, it was loaded with oddly specific language about community development, priorities, and strategic land use optimization. Not exactly terms you see in routine tax enforcement. After she abruptly ended the call, I pored over the documents for another hour. Everything looked legitimate on the surface, but the timing, the process, none of it felt right. This wasn't just a mistake. Someone had deliberately targeted my family's land. I called Ben. I didn't expect sympathy. He'd seen plenty of corruption, but when I explained, his hesitation told me this was bigger than I'd realized. "Timber, this isn't about some misplaced forms. You're up against something much larger." Ben Martinez had over 20 years in property law, often fighting cases involving questionable municipal seizures. "These Pinehurst cases are happening more and more," he told me in his office, surrounded by files. "They use complicated language to confuse owners, speed up the process, and take land before anyone can fight back." He showed me case after case, identical tactics used across rural communities. Owners got little to no notice, then lost property in weeks instead of the months or years typical for a real tax lien process. Ben said the timing was always suspicious. That matched what I later heard from Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, one of my first key sources. She'd watched it happen to others and nearly to herself. They did the same to the Martinez family, she whispered over coffee at the diner, and they almost got me. They won't stop until they own everything worth anything in this county. She kept years of clippings and records, tracking every shady deal. The Martinez family lost 80 acres through the same special assessments and lightning-fast legal proceedings, finding out only when surveyors arrived. Talking to more neighbors, it became painfully clear this wasn't just about my family. We were part of a much bigger pattern. The same tactics were hitting multiple families in the area, always following the same playbook: wrong addresses, buried notices, and lightning-fast auctions that left owners no real chance to fight back. The wrong address trick meant official notices were sent to places that had nothing to do with the actual owner, guaranteeing they'd never see them in time. More than a few people only learned their land was gone when they showed up to find construction crews tearing into what used to be theirs. The hidden notices were just as bad, posting legal announcements in out-of-the-way spots no one would reasonably check. On paper, it counted as legal notification, but in reality, it ensured the deadlines passed before anyone even knew a case existed. And the expedited auctions were the final blow, compressing timelines so severely that hiring a lawyer or raising the money to challenge an assessment was nearly impossible. This wasn't bad luck or sloppy bureaucracy, it was coordinated, deliberate, systematic. Katherine Sterling's name kept showing up in the paperwork for multiple acquisitions, always listed as HOA representative or community development consultant. Her role suggested someone was using HOA authority and feel-good development language to mask what looked like an organized campaign of property theft targeting rural landowners. Every one of these transactions turned a hefty profit while technically staying inside the legal lines. I began logging every single phone call, every document, every scrap of evidence, not just for my case, but for the bigger pattern. My dining room turned into a command center, covered with files and carefully built timelines that revealed just how far the web reached. Courthouse records made things even clearer. Over the last 18 months, Pinehurst Development had snapped up more than 3,000 acres of prime rural land, all using nearly identical tactics: special assessments, fast-track tax lien sales, and sudden transfers. The combined value was over $15 million. This wasn't random, it was a business strategy. Municipal records showed Katherine had a seat on development review committees in 4 counties, giving her insider access to zoning changes and infrastructure projects long before the public knew about them. That kind of early knowledge meant she could spot high-value targets before anyone else and move in while the price was low. Ben's legal research confirmed what I was starting to suspect. Pinehurst was exploiting vague, loophole-filled municipal code language to slap owners with charges they could barely even appeal, especially with timelines deliberately shortened to make challenges almost impossible. It's legal manipulation, Ben said. They've built a system that steals property while keeping it technically lawful. But the most damning discovery came late one night, flipping through yet another stack of courthouse files. On the last page of one transfer contract, scrawled almost carelessly, was a note that tied Katherine Sterling personally to Pinehurst far beyond her public HOA role. The handwriting matched hers exactly, something I'd seen on HOA letters. The notation pointed to direct financial stakes in development deals. It was the conflict of interest I'd been looking for. That's when things shifted. First, a car parked across the street. There more often than not. Then I'd catch someone watching from a cafe window. Same person, different places. Always where I was digging for information. It escalated. The same dark sedan turned up in courthouse parking lots when I went to pull records. And that same figure lingered near the coffee shop where I met Ben. This wasn't paranoia anymore. Someone was tracking me, and it wasn't idle curiosity. The break-in sealed it. I came home to find my front door wide open. No signs of forced entry. Inside, the place had been searched, not ransacked. Papers were scattered methodically, like someone looking for specific files. But what turned my stomach was the targeted destruction: my grandfather's keepsakes, smashed or shredded. Old photographs ripped in half, his handwritten letters torn to pieces. They weren't just after documents. They were trying to erase the emotional heart of why I was fighting. This was personal. They wanted me to know that resisting would cost me more than just the land. The police came, took photos, filed the report, and politely told me that without witnesses or hard evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Looks like they were after something specific, the officer said, but admitted they had no way of knowing what or if they'd gotten it. His advice was to upgrade my locks and add cameras. Practical, but it didn't touch the real problem. Someone with money and influence had decided to make my life very uncomfortable. The timing was too perfect. The break-in came just days after I uncovered Katherine's financial link to It was a warning. Back off, forward, there'd be more. But instead of scaring me off, it convinced me I was close to exposing something big. People don't escalate to illegal tactics unless there's something worth hiding. My deeper dive into Katherine's past turned up even more. She'd worked for multiple development corporations in other states, always in roles that gave her access to local officials and smoothed the way for controversial projects. This wasn't her first time playing this game. The break-in hadn't been random, it was a last-ditch effort to shut me down before I connected the dots. As I dug deeper into courthouse archives and compared them with property transfer records, I uncovered something far darker than I'd imagined when I began this investigation. Hidden beneath my father's old desk, overlooked during the break-in, was a folder containing correspondence about land acquisitions documents that revealed deliberate, long-term planning for property seizures across the region. Reading through decades-old letters, I realized this was a targeted, systematic effort against rural landowners. Pinehurst Development had been quietly working with local officials for years, cultivating relationships and crafting legal frameworks that enabled them to acquire large amounts of land through special assessment processes so complex most owners couldn't understand them, much less challenge them. This wasn't the case of a few opportunists exploiting loopholes for personal gain. This was an organized conspiracy involving corporations, government officials, and community leaders working together to transfer private property into the hands of development firms using questionable, yet technically legal, mechanisms that delivered massive profits to those with the right connections. Ben cautioned me about taking this fight public. "You're not just defending your land anymore, Timber," he warned. "You're taking on corporate giants with deep pockets, powerful lawyers, and political influence you can't match in court." I understood his warning wasn't defeatist, it was a pragmatic reminder of the cost, both personal and financial, of challenging entrenched power. These weren't people who played fair. They had already shown they were willing to use intimidation, surveillance, and break-ins. Taking them on in public could escalate their tactics in ways we couldn't predict or control. Still, I couldn't walk away. They'd already stolen my family's land, my peace of mind, and I had nothing left to lose by exposing their corruption. The bigger question became, how far was I willing to go? Fighting back meant risking financial ruin, even if I won. Walking away meant validating their methods and leaving other rural property owners defenseless. Preparing for the HOA meeting meant organizing years of evidence into a narrative clear enough for everyday residents to grasp, but detailed enough to show the corruption wasn't random, it was systematic, coordinated, and widespread. That's when Gina Martinez became my most crucial ally. Hands trembling, she passed me an envelope full of financial records and internal emails from Pinehurst Development. "I've watched this happen for years," she confessed, her voice unsteady. "I can't let them keep doing this to people. But if they find out I helped you, I'll lose everything, my job, my livelihood, everything I've built." Gina had spent years in financial administration for major development companies. She knew exactly how these schemes worked, how rural properties with aging owners were singled out, their emotional attachments exploited, and their lack of resources used against them. One email spelled it out bluntly: emotional attachment makes them vulnerable to pressure tactics, while limited resources prevent effective legal resistance. Her evidence also revealed that Katherine Sterling, through her HOA and community board roles, was paid handsomely for identifying valuable properties, assessing owners' vulnerabilities, and manufacturing community support for Pinehurst projects, disguised as public benefit. The HOA meeting drew more than 100 residents, more than any meeting in the association's history. Rumors had spread about corruption and questionable property acquisitions threatening the neighborhood's stability and value. When Katherine stood before the crowd, her smile didn't falter, but her eyes betrayed calculation. She wasn't defending community interests. She was protecting investments and relationships that kept the profits flowing to insiders. I presented the evidence, the timeline of property seizures, the financial links between Katherine and Pinehurst, and the targeting of rural landowners through dubious tax collection and acquisition procedures. It painted a picture of conspiracy, not coincidence. The room split. Some were outraged, others fearful of provoking corporate retaliation, but most agreed something had to be done. Just as I thought I had swayed the room, Katherine locked eyes with me and said coldly, "You don't know who you're messing with, Mr. Walker. You're playing a dangerous game, and you're about to lose everything you think you're fighting for." Her warning was clear. She had the resources and influence to crush opposition. But I had no intention of backing down. This wasn't just about my land anymore. This was about years of systematic theft, executed under the guise of legality by corporations, politicians, and developers who counted on ordinary people not understanding the game. Ben reminded me again of the stakes. They've got money, lawyers, political clout. Even if you win, the fight could ruin you. But by then my decision was already made. I wasn't fighting for property value, I was fighting to end the theft. This fight was about preventing other families from losing generational property to the same calculated fraud that had stripped my grandfather's land and endangered the financial stability of rural communities across the region. The principle of property rights and legal accountability was worth defending at any cost, especially when the alternative meant allowing entrenched corruption to persist unchecked. The first court hearing exposed the highly refined legal strategy that Katherine Sterling and Pinehurst Development had built to justify their acquisitions and dismantle my allegations of systemic fraud and procedural abuse. Their defense team, 5 seasoned attorneys from a top municipal law and development defense firm brought legal firepower far beyond anything I could match through traditional means. The session was grueling and more professionally intimidating than I'd imagined. Despite Ben's warnings about the corporate tendency toward aggressive tactics, Katherine's lawyers attacked every aspect of our case, probing relentlessly for weaknesses to undermine our evidence and arguments. With ample resources, they could distort facts, challenge protocols, and sow reasonable doubt about the coordinated nature of the exploitation we had uncovered over months of investigation. Their narrative painted me as a bitter landowner unwilling to accept lawful tax collection and municipal assessment procedures. They asserted that special assessments were legally sanctioned under existing codes, that notification requirements had been met in accordance with law, and that property transfers followed legitimate auction processes that provided sufficient opportunities for contest. The legal citations they presented were sharp and convincing, backed by a deep command of municipal law that could easily persuade a judge unfamiliar with the broader pattern of abuse. Their use of precedent and procedural rules lent an air of legitimacy that would be hard to dismantle without equally advanced legal resources still. Our timeline and documentation showed clear coordination rather than chance pointing to conspiracy, not coincidence. The judge's response was cautious but interested, signaling that further examination was warranted to determine whether repeated violations had occurred or if these were simply aggressive but lawful acquisitions. When she ordered discovery and authorized an expanded probe, it was the first meaningful step toward piercing the shield of legality Katherine and Pinterest had constructed. The subtle shift in Katherine's expression told me she recognized the danger. Her confidence wavered when the court granted full access to Pinterest's financial records and operational practices records that, if exposed, could crumble the foundation of her enterprise. For an operation dependent on secrecy and procedural manipulation, this level of transparency was dangerous then. An anonymous note appeared in my briefcase during the hearing, handwritten name linking a high-ranking local official directly to Katherine's projects. This revealed a conflict of interest that went beyond influence peddling. It exposed elected officials actively enabling private profit at the expense of their constituents' property rights. The FBI's investigation, led by Special Agent Martinez, was already advancing faster than I anticipated, connecting Pinterest to local government corruption. What began as a property fraud case was now expanding into potential violations of federal racketeering laws, charges that carried the possibility of long prison terms. The urgency skyrocketed when Tyler Morrison, Katherine's business partner and financial architect for Pinterest's acquisitions, surfaced as a flight risk. His deep knowledge of the scheme's inner workings made him both a critical witness and a dangerous liability for the others. Evidence of his escape plan, including large cash withdrawals and a booked flight to Switzerland, showed panic spreading through the organization. If he fled, the case could collapse without his insider testimony and access to records only he possessed. Martinez scrambled to coordinate with multiple agencies to block his escape while navigating the legal constraints. On detaining him, surveillance teams tracked his asset liquidations and movements, documenting proof of his awareness that the investigation was closing in. Complicating matters was the risk of interference from compromised local officials, some of whom may have been aiding federal efforts while others obstructed them. Katherine's legal team, anticipating federal action, was preparing challenges to jurisdiction and framing the acquisitions as legitimate business practices. But the evidence of interstate conspiracy was strong enough to support racketeering, an asset forfeiture, potentially stripping away years of ill-gotten gains. If Tyler cooperated, his knowledge of offshore accounts and cross-border dealings could uncover even deeper crimes: money laundering, tax evasion, and an entire web of illicit financial activity. The stakes for him were massive: cooperate and face reduced charges, or stay silent and risk decades in prison. Federal prosecutors were ready to offer Tyler Morrison reduced prison time in exchange for full cooperation, complete testimony, insider details, and access to evidence that could dismantle the criminal organization and recover stolen assets for victim compensation. But his escape preparations told another story. Tyler clearly believed fleeing was better than cooperating, even knowing the crushing criminal penalties that awaited if he was caught without a plea deal. That decision spoke volumes. Either he had extraordinary confidence in his ability to disappear beyond the reach of law enforcement, or he was terrified of retaliation from associates who could not risk exposure if Tyler made it out of the country. The consequences would be devastating. Other members of the conspiracy could destroy evidence, vanish, and secure their fortunes. Swiss banking secrecy laws and the slow, complex extradition process meant federal investigators might never gain access to his accounts, or him time was running out. The FBI monitored every move, knowing that once he boarded that plane, the investigation might collapse without his testimony and the critical financial records only he could unlock. He had already checked in for his flight. My stomach tightened as I realized how close we were to losing everything we'd fought for. If he got away, it would be game over, justice and accountability gone with him. For 2 relentless years, this fight had consumed my life, burning through personal relationships, draining financial resources and grinding down my emotional stability. My health had suffered. My relationships with friends and family had frayed. Peace of mind had been replaced with constant tension. Even after threats passed, sleep disorders lingered, and my doctor warned of lasting stress-related damage. But thinking of the families who faced the same kind of theft and legal manipulation hardened my resolve. Stopping now would mean allowing this system of exploitation to keep preying on rural landowners with no resources to fight back. My grandfather's legacy and the dreams of hundreds of other families depended on bringing this conspiracy into the light and destroying it completely. Then it happened. 40 minutes before his scheduled departure to Switzerland, federal agents arrested Tyler Morrison at the airport. His capture preserved the evidence needed to dismantle the organization and prevented the biggest risk to the case from slipping away. Within hours, coordinated raids swept across 6 states, over 50 federal agents securing computers, financial ledgers, internal communications, and property transfer records. The scale of the operation revealed just how deep and organized the fraud ran. Under pressure, Tyler began cooperating. His testimony and insider documents unlocked offshore banking accounts and traced international financial networks, evidence of money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy stretching across a dozen countries. That information allowed prosecutors to build ironclad cases against every key player. The most dramatic arrest came at dawn, when agents surrounded Katherine Sterling's Lakefront mansion. The raid seized her personal records, business ledgers, and communications that proved her central role in orchestrating a systematic property theft operation through manipulation of municipal law. Forensic accountants estimated the scheme had stolen over $40 million in property value from vulnerable owners. Watching her empire unravel was surreal. Years of corruption and calculated exploitation were suddenly over when her mansion went to federal auction, raising more than $12 million for victims. It felt like justice, not just for my family, but for every person who had been robbed of their legacy. Ultimately, the prosecution dismantled the entire organization. Katherine received 25 years in federal prison. Tyler got 18 years plus full asset forfeiture, and 14 other co-conspirators were sentenced to between 5 and 15 years. Asset recovery returned stolen property to rightful owners and compensated victims. My family's 1,200 acres were restored, along with funds to cover the enormous legal costs of the fight. Across 6 states, more than 300 families saw their land returned or received significant compensation. The case reshaped the law. Legislative reforms tightened oversight of municipal tax and property seizure procedures, closing loopholes that had made the fraud possible. The Sterling Act, named after the case, created federal criminal penalties for systemic property acquisition fraud. In the aftermath, communities began to heal. Property values rebounded, markets stabilized, and trust, though slow to return, began to rebuild. On my restored land, I built the Justice Center, offering free legal aid and education to property owners at risk. In its first year, it helped more than 500 families. Standing on the soil my grandfather cleared with his own hands, I installed a bronze plaque at the entrance, in memory of those who lost land to corporate greed, in honor of those who fight back against corruption. Each year, memorial services honor victims of similar schemes. As Katherine was led away in handcuffs, I felt the weight of victory, but also the knowledge that this war was far from over. Laws can change, oversight can improve, but corporate greed will always circle like a predator. Property rights are never safe without constant vigilance, and so the fight continues.